One of the greatest mechanisms ever invented by humanity for thriving and survival is science. So in a period of high uncertainty and challenge, it makes sense to perhaps check in with a scientist here and there. And perhaps the best scientist to check in with in the world is our good friend, David Krakauer. Hi, David. How are you?
I'm well. Nice to be with you, Rob.
Great. So how are things at the Santa Fe Institute?
Well, things are difficult in the sense they're difficult for everybody, that people are working remotely and so forth. On the other hand, we've reached a point where complexity has become so obvious in the world and new ideas about complex systems are required. So in that sense, we're busier than ever because we've been very involved in the crisis and all of its sequelae.
So recently you wrote an article with Jeffrey West that appeared in Nautilus. And in this article, you argued that this is the first complexity crisis in history. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think we were pointing out essentially that we have now reached a point where all the critical systems of the world have come into alignment. It's like an extraordinary astronomical event. That, as I said earlier, dietary preference, the density of social gatherings, the ubiquity of cheap transport, the density of cities, etc., have aligned so many networks, so many different networks, economic, ecological, social, that a perturbation that normally might have been contained within any one of them. So think about an economic crisis, typically the markets, right? And there are obviously consequences on life. But here, all of these networks are aligned. So they all came down together. And we're calling that a complexity crisis. And we think it's new by virtue of urbanization, population density, technological connection, etc. So I think that whereas before you could fix a problem by fixing one of the systems, our sense now is that's no longer adequate, that now we need to have a systemic intervention. And that's something that society is not yet prepared for.
How do we have to think differently about these interconnected systems?
So these things are popping up all the time. So what's happened? Right, what's happened in part is human beings encroaching on areas of huge biodiversity. There are an estimated 2 million viruses that we've never yet encountered. Let's say a quarter of them have a mammalian intermediate host, which means that phylogenetically it's possible for them to jump to us.
Right.
Okay. What's changing is the rate of encounter of the human population with the non-human food sources. And it's coupled to things like deforestation, exactly agriculture, as you mentioned. So we're encroaching into the territories which are precisely the hotbeds of biodiversity from which we expect to be exposed to viruses. That level of contact is somewhat unprecedented in human history, meaning it's decades old, not centuries old.
In the article, you also talk about evolvability versus robustness. And I'd like you to explain that briefly, because for all of our business and organizational leaders with us today, they experience this in an analogous way in their businesses. So becoming great at what you do right now also opens you up to the threat of being disrupted in the future. Being evolvable means having a portfolio of options, but those options come at a cost. So talk about this notion from a complex system perspective of evolvability versus robustness.
Yeah, it's one of the most profound dualities in all complex systems. So let's define them. So robustness is the ability of a system to withstand a non-trivial perturbation. So you remove something essential and yet it continues to function. Evolvability is the ability of a system to discover new solutions to problems. Okay? So it goes beyond adaptation. It's actually innovative evolvability. And all systems experience the trade-off, right? So that if you build a system that's impervious to change in the environment, well, then how is it going to respond adaptively and evolve to the change in the environment? Now, life has discovered a whole series, a suite of mechanisms which allow you to balance the trade-offs. The most brutal of which is extinction and death. Most species on Earth, 99% of them, have gone extinct. And so evolvability has been achieved through essentially the survival of whatever particular function is working at that time, and everything else disappears. But that's not how our bodies work. And the way our bodies work is by investing a huge amount of energy into redundancy of various kinds. So bodies pay the energetic cost of robustness. And I think that's the thing that companies perhaps haven't understood. The market works according to the Darwinian principle. But maybe companies don't want to. And I think that will require a shift in emphasis, that if you're investing in the long term, you have to pay the cost of redundancy. There's no way out. And then how you achieve evolvability is maybe a more technical discussion. We can talk about it if you like. But I think it's very important to understand that without the redundancy, there is no robustness.
David, what are one or two insights from those essays that strike you?
Cities work. That's, I think, surprises a lot of people. We referred to it earlier, but this incredible empirical fact that the scaling of economic productivity, creativity in cities, as measured by things like filing patents and so on, the scaling exponent is identical to the scaling exponent for transmissible disease and violent crime. And it's a 15% compounding effect in both cases. So if you increase the size of a city, you get this benefit of scale for productivity and creativity, but you absolutely have to pay the cost in terms of increased disease transmission. And that is an extraordinary discovery, an empirical discovery. And the question that we're all trying to deal with is, can we decouple those two?
So can we have the benefits without the costs, or how can we mitigate the costs? What are we finding in that respect?
Well, there are places that deviate in one way or another from that empirical law. And I don't think we yet know why. The underlying theory has to do with the connectivity of the urban graph, if you like, the density, the division of labor. And I think what we're doing now, actually, Rob, where we somehow decouple the physical interaction from the informatic interaction, is going to be the answer to this problem. I mean, we all know that. Interesting.
So to oversimplify by physical versus informatic, do you mean like what we're doing right now? We're having an interaction via data in a virtual space, but we have no physical connections. So therefore, the information can transmit rapidly, but the pathogen cannot.
Exactly. And we know how to decouple them. The big unanswered question, of course, for all of us is, to what extent is creativity coupled to physicality?
To what extent is physicality essential for amplifying our creative capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is what we're all debating without a great deal of insight into it. It would seem on the one hand that you and I could quite easily write a paper or come up with a new idea without ever meeting. Why not? And, plenty of game players will form teams online that are extraordinarily effective, and they've never met each other. So we know it's possible. But there's something that seems to be required that's social, that we're not yet grasping. And maybe we can learn from the games environment.
Is it possible that the hypothesis that there might be something essential about physicality is more based on a bias of our billions of years of evolution, that we have evolved within that physical soup and therefore we have a bias in favor of it as opposed to a clear-headed, objective observation of where we might be going.
It's possible. There's a whole area called the evolution of cooperation. So think about things like tit for tat and the prisoner's dilemma and so forth.
Yeah, game theory.
Game theory that studies, that studies these cooperative solutions in non-cooperative games, sometimes called Nash equilibria.
Yeah.
And what one learns mathematically in those games is an absolute key to finding cooperative, coordinated equilibria is repeated interaction. If you play one-shot games, you always get the negative, rather dire outcomes, right? Selfishness prevails. And I think one of the things that physicality did for free, by virtue of our limited mobility, is it ensured that we'd meet again, right? So Rob, if I'm your neighbor,
yeah,
and I steal your car, right? I'm there the next day for you to find me.
Yeah, well, I think, David, there's a concept called propinquity, which makes great sense, which is the people around us, near us, are much more likely to be our friends or enemies because we have regular interactions with them.
But that's an interesting insight, Rob, because if this is true, that it's not physicality per se, but what in our world we call assortativity, what you're calling propinquity, maybe we can generate that by some other means to ensure we arrive at these cooperative equilibria. Again, not really been explored, but it's very interesting.
One of the aspects of your work, and we've talked about this a number of times, that intrigues me is you say everybody spends time looking at performance or intelligence. You want to study stupidity. How does it work? Where does it come? How does it work? Where does it come from? How does something like stupidity end up in a result of an evolutionary survival-based system?
Yeah, so again, from my point of view, operationally, intelligence is making hard problems easy, and stupidity is making easy problems hard. So that's
stupidity is making easy problems hard.
Exactly.
Great.
And so I think the deep answer to this question is the evolution of rule systems that misalign with their time and context. And that's how evolution works, right? You acquire algorithms in some sense. They could be genetic, the way that genes are regulated, turned on and off, or the way we think through problems. And culture is this incredible mechanism that transmits these, by and large, historically adaptive rule systems forward in time. But the world changes, and those rules in that new context make relatively easy problems harder. And that's, I think, the ultimate origin. I study evolution. So I study things that are over 3 billion years old in terms of life on Earth. And so life's been around for quite a while. Planet's about 4.5 billion years old. The Homo lineage is about 3 million. Modern humans are about 300,000. Agriculture is about 10,000. Science, parliamentary democracy, 300. America, 200, right? So we're dealing with relatively new phenomena in the history of the planet. And they were created in a certain context to deal with a certain problem. Certainly the US Constitution, which is something that I've studied, was created to deal with problems of despotic monarchs. That's part of the big deal. And now you could make an argument that hasn't gone away.
And we're on our way back, trending back toward that.
We could be trending back towards that, and the Constitution might become more important than it was then, perhaps.
Absolutely.
But there might be periods where it wasn't so useful. And so I think reckoning with rule systems that are no longer adaptively appropriate, that's what the study of stupidity is about.
And it sounds like part of this is human beings or any kind of agent, any kind of actors within these rule systems having an inability or at least a difficulty of standing back from the rule systems, reflecting on the context and seeing if the rule systems are still fit for purpose. because we continue on our path dependent where we've been doing this forever. We've been shaking hands. We've been, hugging when we see each other. Well, in a pandemic environment, that probably isn't the best thing to do.
Yeah, it gets to your earlier question about robustness and evolvability, which is what culture does well is transmit rule systems. Wisdom, real ideas that worked, that we are acquiring for free, that we're the beneficiaries of. So it's very important to understand that. So take science, for example. Science benefits from the accumulated understanding of the natural and cultural world. On the other hand, that inertia that's built into the system that's so important has what has led to the resistance to new theories, right? So famously plate tectonics, obviously even more famously, the geocentric theory of our solar system.
Right. Yeah.
So there are good reasons to resist change because good ideas shouldn't be subject to tiny fluctuations in opinion. So how do we do that? And I think what stupidity is the name we give to the instantaneous misalignment of requirement and rule. And the question is, how do we fix it?
David, looking forward, how is Santa Fe Institute preparing for beyond the pandemic?
I think there's sort of two questions there. One is about our role in the culture as a producer of ideas and solutions. And the other is the internal structure of the Institute in terms of its viability, right? So for us, the most important thing is to be responsive to the crisis and generate the best science we can, right? And make sure that the science is true to the need. As I mentioned to you earlier, one of the very surprising consequences of this pandemic has been a significant increase in SFI's engagement with the world, both in terms of the adoption of its science, but our community. We have more participation now than we've ever had. By almost 3 to 4 times.
So David, you mean people from anywhere in the world who are logging in for your webinars, for your lectures, for your roundtables, which you have on a regular basis at Santa Fe Institute, but for the most part, they were in person before.
It's much, for example, we'd have a meeting on what might seem like a rather esoteric topic. And we have these meetings, every week. And we'd see the same people, plus or minus a few, member of our external faculty. But now we have parliamentarians. We have, directors of major banks. We have social activists. There's been it's not just the numbers, it's the diversity of people looking to complexity and presumably other forms of science and insight to help them with their particular causes. One thing that surprised me is maybe shouldn't be surprising, is that the groups that adopt some of these new methodologies aren't necessarily the most powerful. And they're more flexible. They're more willing to adopt new methods because it's more important to in some sense, catalyze change. So that's obvious in hindsight, but it was a very nice thing to discover in practice during this period.
So, David, coming down to the end, but in 20 years, there's a tweet storm about David Krakauer. You're happy about it. What is the tweet storm?
It's that David and Rob finally, after 20 years of being holed up in their homes, could meet again. That's interesting.
I find it hard to believe that many people would really care about that.
You
and me.
Yeah, perhaps we would care. We care. I want to hear you sing again. I think God, that's a good question. Because as you know, I'm on no social media at all. And so it's not a world I live in. I think in the end, I don't know the answer, but it would be very nice to think that some major transition in the way society works came from the kind of science that we do, and that it was constructive. Science for good. I think we have been perhaps naive historically in thinking that science and policy and politics and society are not complexly entangled, but they are. And I think as we go into a more and more complex world, our kind of science becomes more and more critical, which means we have to be much more careful So whereas it was atomic energy in the 40s and 50s, it might be complexity science in the next several decades. So I'd like that tweet not to be, there was a, radioactive complexity meltdown, but actually that some new insight helped in some significant way.
Well, great. David, this has been fantastic as always, and I do look forward to our next opportunity to be together in person. An extraordinary astronomical event has recently occurred. The first complexity crisis in human history hits our entire planet. Evolvability versus robustness. We all need to manage those trade-offs. How can we have both at the same time? How can we amplify as well the things that we love and de-emphasize the things we don't? Are the rule systems we have misaligned with our evolving context? As the world changes, do we change appropriately? As the great 20th century epistemologist and political philosopher Karl Popper articulated, by criticizing our theories, we let our theories die in our stead. With organizations like the Santa Fe Institute and scientists like David Krakauer leading the way, we all have a hope of having a better future. David, thank you again for your time and your insights.
Thank you very much. Live long and prosper.
Great. Nanu nanu.
Nanu nanu.
Sincere thanks to David Krakauer again. He's been with us at Twin 5 times now, and every time I feel more educated and inspired. Complexity theory, we need a lot more of it now in this complexity crisis. We also need more complexity practice. I'd like to challenge everyone with us today to think more broadly about the circles in which you live, to connect the various systems within which your company, your organization, your nonprofit, your government agency operates and you operate in your lives. Because all of these systems are becoming more intimately connected and assaulted by change that is accelerating. So in my travels around the world, I look for people, leaders, who look more broadly at their field. And the next segment is an excerpt from a series of excerpts from an hour-long interview I did with 2 phenomenal leaders from very different worlds in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. Owen Brennan, the chairman of Devonish Group, and his wife, Alice Stanton, who is a medical doctor and an expert in cellular therapeutics from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, who also works in nutrition in Devonish Group. Devonish Group is in the agriculture space, and they bought this company a number of years ago. It was very, very small. Today it's a $300 million a year business growing rapidly. And given it's private, I can't tell you exactly the numbers, but the percentage of their business they spend, of their revenues they spend on R&D and people, think about Rita McGrath's comment earlier, is astounding. The type of work they are doing is profound and will affect all of us in the future. While you listen to these brief excerpts of our interview, I'd like you to reflect on how broadly and deeply they think about all the way from soil to human health at society level. So let's roll these excerpts.
I think we need to take a whole systems approach. We need to recognize all the constituents and their complexities in order to look for solutions for how we feed the world with nutritious food in a sustainable fashion. And we need to look at if the emissions, the carbon dioxide and the methane that has been produced by cattle is, and it is a problem, how do we reduce those emissions? And that's possible. And how do we sequester or store more carbon dioxide equivalents in our soils and in our hedges? So that's what Devonish is grappling with and is providing solutions towards, is addressing that complex system in a whole systems approach.
But I'm going to go with perhaps he would suggest that if we wanted to learn something new, we should read an old book. And my second alternative was going to be we should really pay a lot of attention to nature and try and figure out what nature has to say about the questions we have. When you think about those 19th century big thinkers, they were whole system people. They had a huge range of interests and activities and talents. I suspect we've become maybe a little too specialized individually and collectively. And there's a phrase for that which talks about we've developed this incredible ability to shine intense beam of light on very narrow subjects of interest. And I'm inclined to suggest that the solution to that is not to lower the intensity of the light, it's to widen the beam. Let's look a bit wider. Let's try and be a little bit less specialized. And so that's where some of the Darwin references were coming from. So could that challenge of nourishing all those people actually represent one of the biggest opportunities on our planet at this time? So we're going to need a lot of carbon to produce that high quality food affordably and in the sort of quantities we're considering. And if you track back to our focus on soil, the sort of numbers we look at today are that our soils contain somewhere between 2 and 3 times the amount of carbon that our enriched atmosphere contains. So if we could keep a little more of that carbon we're drawing down in our soils, we might be well on our way to tackling that problem of enrichment of our atmosphere with carbon. And when you think about it, a lot of that carbon that's up there that's causing a problem has come from the ground. So how about putting it back in the ground by mobilizing our soils? So addressing it in that way, a 25% uplift in our soil carbon would more than half our atmospheric carbon load. If you came to our Global Research Center in Douth, one of the things we'd show you is what we call our multi-species pastures. So, as you know, monocultures don't occur in nature, and yet a lot of our farming and food systems are monoculture based and monoculture focused. And that applies to pasture just as much as it does to our croplands. So we've been looking at changing that and doing some multi-species comparisons. And those are very much focused on not just taking more carbon from the atmosphere, but also drawing our nitrogen from the atmosphere. And we've been amazed at the quantities those pastures are producing, which obviously means they're drawing down more carbon than currently is the case. But they're also drawing down huge quantities of nitrogen from the atmosphere, which reduces our dependence on inorganic nitrogen. So it's a double win. And just to make the additional point that we don't forget the nitrogen we take from the atmosphere is in fact organic nitrogen. So comparing organic nitrogen to an inorganic nitrogen is like comparing an apple with an orange. Organic nitrogen is in the form the plant wants, it's where the plant wants it. So it's, again, another win. I think the benefit of taking a more holistic view, widening the beam, is let's first consider how we can deliver these multiple outcomes simultaneously. So really good, affordable food, which is nourishing. Really good environmental outcomes, water quality, good air quality, good soil health, very high level positive biodiversity outcomes. And time and again, when we do these optimizations at scale, we find not only is that perfectly possible, but success in one area feeds success in every other.
I'm going to take the pair of us as an example for hope. Up until 10 years ago, our careers were completely separate. Owen was in the agri-tech area and I was in the human health area, totally separate. But we started talking to each other and realized that actually what each of us was doing was having an impact on the other's world. So we're a small example of a multidisciplinary approach, and I'm seeing this in lots of places. So we are starting to see the soil scientists, the producers of food, the farmers, talking to the agri-tech people, talking to the food processors, to the retailers. We're starting to get the health professionals talking to each other first. So the nutritionists talking to the doctors and the nurses involved in public health, and eventually to the consumer. So I think we need both a whole systems approach and the multiple disciplines all starting to understand each other. So it's really valuable to me as a health professional to start to understand agriculture and to realize that actually agriculture, as well as producing emissions, can actually sequester carbon and at the same time produce really nutritious food.
Owen and Alice are two of my heroes in the food and agriculture space. Did you hear how broad and deep their thinking is, and the fact that they've grown together from disparate fields to focus on this very large, complex set of interlocking systems? By the way, the comments that Owen made about reading an old book, I asked him a question: what advice would your favorite author, Charles Darwin, give to us today? And that was his answer. With this, I have the privilege and a heartfelt thanks to Jesus Mantas, a Twinian with us for over a decade, a top executive at IBM, one of our sponsors and supporters here at Twin, but also a very good friend of ours who is facing stage 4 cancer. Jesus, being an optimistic, energetic person always focused on the future with openness and love, offered these comments that we pre-recorded about his experience and about where we are as we move to the future. We'll share this video, which again, we're so thankful for, and then Jesus and I will have a brief conversation following. Let's roll the video.
Most people think that resilience is a good word. So did I, up until a year ago. I was part of a discussion with a decorated war veteran, and he gave me a humbly memorable lesson. After he told his story, I told him I admire his resilience. And he politely replied, "You know, resilience is one of those words that I hate the most. Resilience implies all your energy goes to recreate the world before your trauma, to pretend that trauma never happened. Resiliency doesn't offer the possibility that maybe there is a better world, a fuller, richer world you can aspire to be in after a trauma." That was a great, memorable lesson, and that lesson helped me when my own trauma happened. So yes, I was recently diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, lymphoma. So you may imagine that I am predisposed to look for silver linings. But studies support my veteran friend's point of view. Learnings from these experiences help me manage my own situation. I've actually come to believe that, in a way, I'm really lucky. I wouldn't choose to get cancer, but if you are to, I am in the luckiest of the positions. I see my situation as an opportunity to shape a better life than the one that I had prior to my diagnosis, and that fuels every day. That is the belief that carries me every week. So a lot of people come up to me and say, "Wow, Jesus, you're taking this diagnosis really well." And I guess it's true. I am. And I tell them, "You know, I have never lacked imagination." And they pause. It's like, "What do you mean?" And interesting is what I've learned is imagination is the single most important element in creating this type of growth mindset. So by adopting this growth mindset, we can actually turn negative events into opportunities for discovery, development, impact. But it's a really, really scary proposition when you're facing a traumatic situation. I mean, think about that. We're designed for the opposite. Our brains are encoded to respond to trauma the way we do to any other threat, fight or flight. In split seconds, the subconscious part of our mind determines if this thing in front of you is going to be a friend or a foe. And in the very next second, it leads to a decision. You're either going to fight this thing or you're going to try to run away from it. So all of this processing in our brain is really being encoded and formed by millions of years. So it's not easy to just face trauma and say, like, I'm going to disregard that. But there is this thing that everybody talks about, a growth mindset. And this growth mindset asks us to do something that is really unnatural. It really asks us to open the aperture of what's in front of us and see the opportunity that surrounds that immediate threat. And when you apply that wider lens, that opportunity could be actually much greater than the immediate threat. And that is what makes it work. But you need imagination for that. You need the ability to imagine something different in the face of trauma, that it could be better than what you had before. And if you don't have that, then it's very hard to get yourself in that mindset. Now, the example is not only me, there are others. Let me give you a recent example. Many of you may have seen Plamen Rousseff at Twin. His life revolved around webbing, an events organization. His events would gather as many as 15,000 people in Sofia. I was one of them. So you can imagine that for Plamen, a pandemic and the world shutting down all events is their nightmare scenario. As the lockdowns gathered in every single event was canceled. So you would say, well, that would be, that's traumatic. And, Plamen could just basically say, okay, well, I'm just going to close that business and I'm going to figure out something else that I can do. But instead, he did something else. He seized that opportunity to reinvent his business, as he shared with us in Twin. He's transformed Webbit into a digital events company with a very slick platform that hosts incredibly rich virtual programs. And over 1 million people have signed up to use that platform. So in the face of that trauma, he went from 15,000 people before the pandemic to now reaching over 1 million people today. So if we, like Plamen did, can rationally and emotionally accept that life after trauma can be better than it was before, then we can really embrace this journey required to realize that opportunity. You have to be armed with imagination and conviction, and you have to create that new narrative that will put you in a position to have a brand new maximum impact. But even if you have that mindset, it requires a different level of leadership to navigate through all of these situations. And the way I see it is you have two ways to live. There is one with authority, command and control, and the other is through persuasion, community, empowerment. One is all about managing scarcity. The other is about unlocking abundance. Some people call this latter one servant leadership. I prefer to call it authentic leadership. And this authentic leadership is the critical element that is required on periods of high disruption. So let me talk to you about my own journey of authentic leadership, which takes me back to 2.5 years ago when I had the opportunity to travel to Bhutan. Bhutan is a special country, very small country, but special. Special in the way that, for example, in the United States, we measure our prosperity based on gross domestic product. Bhutan uses a different measure. called gross national happiness. And this gross national happiness is informed by the fact that, Bhutanese culturally behave in a manner that puts the collective needs before their personal needs. So what I learned in that trip is most Bhutanese actually get up every morning and they ask themselves, what does the world need from me the most today? And that basically guides how they act. Can you imagine as a leader if you get up every day and you ask, what is it my community needs the most? What is it my team needs the most? What is it that I can do today that it will help the most? But that's what they do. So let me tell you a little bit of a story that is real on how to translate this in what they do. You see, in my trip to Bhutan, I met a number of people, but one of them was Dorji. Dorji works. He has his family, and one of the things that he's been doing is he's been helping the kingdom fight COVID. So he's a very busy person and a very giving person. But he sent me a WhatsApp the other day, and I think the best way to describe leadership is maybe I'll just read from you his WhatsApp to me. So let me just get it on my phone. So he said, this is literally a week ago. Hi, Jesus. How are you doing? Today I got an answer from one of the greatest Buddhist masters of our time. He is known for his spiritual powers and miracles, and is highly sought after for divination and blessings. He mentioned that you're going through a difficult time, but is happy that we reach out to him. He has prescribed the following ceremonies, which will commence tomorrow for 3 days. The ceremonies are Tse Du, Sutra of the Buddha of Infinity Life, 2,000 times. Che Sien, Long Life Prayers, 2,000 times. Menzum, Ceremony of Medicine Buddha, 2,000 times. I would like you to make your wishes as the ceremony starts tomorrow at 7 in the morning Bhutan time. Right now, it is 11:22. That's when he sent me the message. Next message. I have conveyed this to both Justin and Nim. Nim will commission the same prescribed ceremonies at Dodedra. Furthermore, we will also have another set of monks and nuns to conduct the same prayers and ceremonies in another part of Bhutan. So for the next 1 week, we will have 3 temples, one in Sikkim in India and 2 in Bhutan to support you, as you seek the best doctors to help you medically. Nim and I are seeking the best spiritual masters to support you mentally. I am confident everything will be okay with you hereafter. Take care, my friend. See, I couldn't describe anything better of what I am talking about. What I just read to you is what it feels like when somebody is an authentic leader to you, in the way in which Dorji is being an authentic leader to me. In my day job at IBM, when the pandemic struck, we had an opportunity to figure out how do you take these new leadership concepts and do things differently. So as COVID-19 hit, we had to reconfigure the IBM company in real time. How do we do in 2 weeks what we had tried to do before in years? And you can't really reorganize the company. So how do you evolve from command and control to persuading people to work together and do things in 48 hours that before they believed it would take 3 months? And I think in our case, it was this element of authentic leadership was a key element of it. We had what I would call a self-directed team of teams, gather communities, including clients, developers, everybody from different functions, to manage this new set of needs that our clients had from us, got them done in 48 hours, and then refined them in 5 days. And we found that the outcome was really very effective, that this was really agile that we have tried to do for 5 years, but now we're living it as opposed to just learning about it. And we're still learning. I think we're all learning. But with this, I believe we have helped create a set of attitudes and behaviors that in turn are helping to shape our, IBM culture. So in this whole process, one of my reflections of it is that practicing leadership without authority is a superpower. I think you can do so much more when you think of yourself as this, you get up every morning thinking, what are you going to do to maximize the outcome you can do that day, instead of getting up every morning and saying, how am I going to use the resources I have at my disposal to achieve my outcome? It's a different mindset. So the big difference is in the one where you're just managing resources. The only resources you have, the only people you have are those on your team. In this new authentic leadership, it's almost like everybody can be on your team. As long as you can articulate a common goal and they perceive that you're vested in helping them, what happens is everybody just adds to your team. So you have this like infinite set of people that can help you versus just the finite, it's like this scarce set of it. And at the end of the day, as I just, showed with my friend Dorji, it's not like you could command people to gather 3 temples in 2 countries to pray for you. You can't do that, right? So the silver lining in any trauma, my cancer, this pandemic, is the opportunity to take all of these good things that come of it, all of the new behaviors, and make those changes permanent. So we have a window. We have a window of time in the middle of this pandemic that we can figure out if we can make these great changes stick. And that powers our opportunity to emerge from a pandemic or any other trauma as better individuals, better communities, better companies, and frankly shape our planet in a better way. So in all this time, through all this trauma, one of the other things that I have learned is if I don't know what else to do, I'll just go ahead and smile. See, there was a 30-year study by UC Berkeley that showed that smiling is correlated with a host of very positive outcomes. People who smile widely and often live longer. They have better standardized test scores. Their marriages are happier. There was Ron Goodman. He found that smiling reduces the stress-enhancing hormones like cortisol, adrenaline, dopamine, and increases the mood-enhancing hormones like endorphins. As importantly, Ron also discovered that smiling creating the same endorphin that you would get from 2,000 chocolate bars. Can you imagine that? Just smiling versus 2,000 chocolate bars. As we all know, smiling is also contagious. When you smile, so do others. Facial feedback response theory shows that the mirror neurons that emulate the reactions that we perceive from the environment, get active with a smile. So when people smile, our brain mirrors that reaction and triggers that happiness. So in a way, we're used to think that when you're happy, you smile. What science is telling us that when you're smiling, you're creating happiness. Think of us as fantastic empathy machines. And once you figure that out, you can really use smile to make you feel better in the face of trauma, to maybe spark that imagination. And at the end, you're probably going to end up feeling happier. So as we get to the end of this session, I'd like just to recap a few of the concepts that we cover from my own perspective. First, you have to believe that life after trauma can and often is better than before. The path to that life starts with a growth mindset that has to be powered by imagination. Second, authentic leadership is an essential ingredient, a new way to do things to manage all of these teams that have a growth mindset. Third, we're right now in a moment where we have the opportunity to take all of these really good habits that can achieve so much more and make them persist even after trauma, even after the pandemic. And in doing so, we can create a much better culture to care for our planet, for our community, for our companies, and for ourselves. And finally, there is only one thing that you remember of this conversation. I hope that thing is that whatever your situation is, whatever you are, remember to smile. Smile to yourselves, smile to everybody in front of you, because the world will be better when every one of us smiles. Thank you.
Jesus, Mantas, everyone. Jesus, thank you for being here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I was saying this is as bad as you could see me. I literally start my next cycle of chemotherapy today. You can see me. This is as much of a reality TV as you can make it. I am in the suite at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer, starting my monoclonal antibody, which is the beginning.
Well, Jesus, as soon as you had this news to share, you and Christina mustered the team. You reached out to me. You reached out to Justin Milano at Abroad, our twin sibling. And it was actually Justin Milano's group abroad that brought us together in Bhutan. You and I have known each other as twinians for over a decade, but we together went to Bhutan with Abroad. And you reached out to Twin and Abroad and said, is it okay if I share my story? More than okay. It was inspiring and harrowing. It really feels like, Jesus, we're all in the room with you right now. I'm happy that we have to be virtual because I don't think your hospital room can handle all of us at the same time. So it's probably good we're virtual. Jesus, any quick thoughts before you transition to your next treatment for us?
No, I think, hopefully, some of the thoughts that we recorded with the video made sense. I think the question that I get the most is this concept of, do you always have to go to trauma to learn this state of mind, or is that possible without the trauma? And my own reflection on that one is a maybe. I think maybe it's possible, but it takes this different type of leadership. And we just finished a study that I think it gives us one of the keys. So the IBM Institute of Business Value is going to launch next week. It hasn't been launched yet. So this is for the twin audience before it's going to be launched. We actually have interviewed leadership, and there is a significant gap between what we as leaders believe we are doing and the environment we are creating and what people actually perceive that environment is. And it's very acute in COVID-19. One of the questions is we ask employers and executives and leaders in companies, do you believe that you're caring for your employees? And 80% of them say, we are, safety of our employees is number one. But then you ask the employees and only 30% of them say they believe their employer care for that. So if it is about creating new habits, which is a very internal decision that has to stick, I think it's possible to create a state of, if you want, a better state of awareness and a better set of outcomes without going through the trauma. But it does require some special leadership to bridge that gap between the perception of the environment and the idea of the environment that us as leaders believe we're creating.
Well, Jesus, you've certainly shown special leadership for all of us, not just as a business leader, but in your own personal life. Thank you so much for reaching out here. I want you to know that not only are we all in the room with you today and throughout this whole process, but we're all here because we love each other. And that's what's going to get us to a better future more than anything else. Everybody, I urge
Absolutely.
you to go to your delegate conversations now for a little bit. We're going to come back live here at 50 minutes after the hour, so 12:50 after the hour for the next segment. And while you do, I'd urge you to have a conversation about what do Jesus's words mean for you. Thanks again, Jesus. We're with you, and I can't wait to have dinner and reconnect after we're through all of these challenges.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, everybody.
Muchísimas gracias.